Hello and good morning, and thank you for joining our Veeam webinar today, where we're going to be focusing on Veeam Availability Suite 9.5. So we have George Kenny here from Veeam, who's presenting the webinar today.
Fantastic. Okay, well, yeah, just to follow on from Amy, everyone, thank you very much for joining today. It's really nice to have a platform for us to explain some of how our organization operates, how our software products work, and what we're going to do today is we actually tailor that against some topical content, focusing on, as you can see, ransomware, business continuity, and also at the end, some cost-saving measures that you can introduce into your environment when you're pursuing that availability goal. Okay. So I'm going to walk through some of this. My details are on the bottom left here. I'm always on Twitter, LinkedIn, so on and so forth. So we do advocate our SEs. I'm a technical guy as an SE. We do advocate them being available for our community to patch into if you've got any questions. There will also be a Q&A session at the end of the session today, so you can also throw some Qs over the wire to me. So let's move forward. Just to cover off the broad strokes of really what we'll be talking on. Ransomware resiliency, we did this session at IP Expo this year. We focused it more on around IT decision makers, so more the business approach as opposed to the technical approach, and kept it very high level. Now I've sort of done a bit of a Frankenstein today. I've merged this together with maybe some more technical content to maybe bring it real to anyone here that's actually out there pulling the levers, if so to speak, and actually make it more applicable. We're going to also talk about availability and business continuity. So that's really one of the main mantras of Veeam, if you know anything about our organization. And at the end, we'll touch on those cost-saving measures. One of the things I do want to start off with to get a bit of interactive straight away is actually a brief demo. Now, I appreciate many of us have seen ransomware or the legacy of ransomware when it hits your environment, when it hits ultimately the aftermath, okay? We understand what ransomware is. If you haven't been aware of it, then maybe you've been living in a cave for some time, because there's so much news now from BBC, ITV, you know, with the incidents we had earlier in the year with WannaCry and Petya, have really pushed up the awareness of it. So much so I actually had my mother-in-law telling me what ransomware was a few months back. And she'd been, you know, watching the news, explaining how it all functioned, and she did quite a good job of it. So it's pretty relevant now to people being aware that it is out there. But what I want to do is I just want to show you briefly the mechanics of how the actual software works, and maybe bring it home to you as to how easy it is to deploy. I've got a virtual machine here with some content on the desktop. You can see some Word documents and some Excel documents that are there. If I open one of these up, I have got Microsoft Office installed into this virtual machine. This isn't going to take very long. I'm just going to show you very quickly how this works. This is a particular deployment or an exploitation kit we refer to. It's actually a variant of the Locky variant. So I'm just going to unbundle that from the zip file. If I extract it out and drop it onto the desktop or into the folder it's from, tap in the password to unbundle it, and we'll see we actually have the exploitation here. We've got the zip file there and the exploitation here. I'm just going to rename that, so .exe. And the first thing I want you to take a look at is look at the icon. You know, so the distributor of this particular variant has actually made the effort to register this in the Windows DLL directory. So it now has, you know, you'll probably recognize it, the Adobe update icon. So we could call it, you know, Adobe .install, or Adobe, I guess, _ install, or Adobe _update. So it looks perfectly plausible, okay? So I'm actually going to detonate this on this particular virtual machine. Let's just run this now, and we'll come back to this later on. The Locky variant is actually quite intelligent because it only encrypts the first few kilobytes of a file, okay? So it's very, very quick. It proliferates through your file systems very, very rapidly. You can see these files are still here. And if I open up Task Manager on this particular virtual machine, what we'll see is it will start to consume CPU and resources on this particular system. So this could be your file server. It could be maybe a user's desktop inside your environment. And what I've actually done on this particular machine, I've mounted a Z drive mapping. So you can see there is a Z drive mapping, which might represent potentially, it's another batch of files here. You can see it's slightly different. This might represent, you know, a share on your network, maybe a accounts directory, so on and so forth. So we're just going to go back a couple of screens. This is the folder we had, and I'm going to leave that there. We're going to come back to this later on because it'll take a few minutes for this to run on that particular VM. So a couple of headline facts, moving away from the technical guff there. You know, we've seen a lot of these noises in the market industry space, loose stats from particular surveys, reports, Gartner updates, so on and so forth. The ones I want to focus on are some of the ones that are likened more to how we can actually be exposed to such an attack. If you look here, 78% of users claim to have received an email with active warning or security threat and still proceeded to click yes or okay. I myself, I was in a hotel the other day, and there was a captive portal to log into, and as soon as I joined it, added my credentials into that particular wireless network, my Outlook came up saying the certificate of this particular network is not secure. Do you wish to proceed? And I clicked yes. I continued because I made a judgment call that the data I was transmitting wasn't necessarily that particularly private, and I was happy with the security of the environment. They were doing SSL decryption in a particular hotel, but a warning came up, and I pressed yes. I pressed OK to proceed using that. And I think we can all be somewhat guilty of seeing, images like this, warning slides from particular vendors where you press OK, maybe it's an Excel file you receive from the FD or a file you receive from a friend that contains some content. It comes up with a passive warning, and you say, well, actually, no, I think I trust this. I'm going to press OK and continue. And ultimately, we are somewhat, as the end users, guilty of being an accelerator for not just ransomware, but viruses, malware, spear phishing, all of that stuff that we can see on the web these days. And the most recent one is, I've made this very topical, this is actually Bad Rabbit, which, if you've been reading the news, came out on the 24th of October. So this is the Adobe update, looks relatively genuine, some loose differences between the genuine Adobe Flash update that you see out there. But again, that is actually circulating today. And we actually had an email go through at Veeam with this particular slide. So take note of that one, because that is Bad Rabbit, and that's out, a very forceful variant that's out that we're witnessing today. So some of the labels we've seen hit earlier in the year, I'm not trying to scaremonger here, but ultimately these guys are what I would classify as enterprise organizations. They've all openly decreed that they had a spate of a ransomware incident, mainly across WannaCry and Petya earlier in the year. The Hollywood Medical Center actually announced that they'd actually paid $17,000 to reclaim their patient data because they didn't have a valid backup. They didn't have resources to prevent them from the particular issues that went across. So yeah, $17,000 is what they paid to reclaim their data. So ultimately, we can all be exposed. Ultimately, this is the sort of message. And again, it gets worse. Is it really a case of when, not if? Sorry to sound so morbid. I wouldn't necessarily say this is being morbid, but this potentially isn't a bad mantra to have. It's not a bad philosophy to take when you're planning around resiliency in your environment, security, and essentially privacy and security of your environment. To take this approach is maybe not a bad approach. So just to put the cat amongst the pigeons in terms of how Veeam operate as a software organization, we are focused very much on availability, protection of data. If you know anything about Veeam previously, we are an organization that often people would use the word backup to represent what we do, but we do a lot more than that, okay? And to be honest with you, we're on the cure side of the fence. You've often heard the slogan, prevention is better than cure. Well, yes, it is, but we are a software that you would typically use after something bad has happened. We are like your house insurance policy. You execute us when you have a fire, okay? So we are very concerned with making sure that the message is getting out there to our community around ransomware, how to protect against it, but also deploying our software in the correct fashion. Because if you don't deploy Veeam software, or maybe a competitor to us, in the correct platform, okay, the correct mechanism, then also it can't work maybe in the best possible method. We are a victim of our own success to some scale. Ransomware actively looks for file extensions, and we're seeing now ransomware going out there looking for Microsoft VSS shadow copies, looking for extensions for the popular backup vendors such as Symantec and Microsoft and Veeam. Okay, so our file, our .vbk, and that's the extension we use for our backups, is actually susceptible to common and more recent variants of ransomware. So if you don't deploy us in the right mechanism, then you can still be a victim of a successful ransomware attack. So a bit of a pop quiz here. this is a common environment. You know, we have some servers, we have these attached to some production files down the bottom left-hand side. This is just maybe a small environment. This could be 3 servers, it could be 3 data centers, who knows. And then we typically have some sort of fabric or some sort of transport mechanism. In this scenario, it's a LAN, so this green line that connects us to a backup server or some sort of media server that drives your backups. Doesn't necessarily need to be Veeam in this instance. It could be a backup platform that you're using that is from one of the other labels. And we're storing that data down into some sort of disk, some sort of storage array represented by that universal green cylinder icon that represents disk, okay? But what's the problem with this? You know, what is actually the downside with this design or this topology, okay? Well, what you want to try and do in this scenario is add some sort of air gap. We want to break the connectivity from our backup files or our protected data set, okay, and remove it from our production files, okay. The reason for that is that if we have an exploitation on the primary network, then it can traverse that network, it can traverse that LAN fabric, infect our production files, and also infect our backup files. So we need to be careful about the way we deploy the backup framework, okay? So with that air gap, typically what we see is complexity goes up, as does cost. And that's one of the things we've tried to advocate at Veeam in terms of encouraging our software to be easy to deploy, easy to understand, and actually build a successful and scalable architecture that is going to protect your production environment and your backup environment. Because like I said, if you deploy us in the wrong fashion, you can be at the mercy of having ransomware attack your backup files, which is never a good thing. So some of the things we can do to avoid this are frameworks. What do I mean by a framework? A framework is a set of protocols or a language that allows systems to communicate, okay? So you could argue that Windows is a framework. It's a framework of an operating system that allows it to speak to other operating systems, other Windows framework systems, okay? TCP/IP, networking, all these things are network frameworks, protocol frameworks that allow separate systems to communicate. The downside is that when we introduce frameworks into our organizations, which we've done over the last 20, 30 years to allow ease of communication across internal systems and external systems, we're also providing a platform for things like viruses, corruption, malware, ransomware to proliferate throughout them, okay? So what we need to look at is providing maybe a discombobulated framework within our environment, creating segmentation, creating a separate network of frameworks that can't potentially talk to each other. So almost breaking the mold of what we've been taught to do for all those years. We have to be vigilant here about how we can use technology at the best possible framework, the best possible mechanism, okay? So one of the first ones I want to talk to you about is SAN snapshots. I'm going to cover up some loose frameworks here in terms of ones that I feel are particularly relevant in terms of your ambition to protect against ransomware. SAN snapshots, SAN stands for Storage Area Network. It's something we would see in most organizations these days. It's essentially a physical or a virtual device that will store data. And what we typically see within storage arrays, things that are storing virtual machines, data, file systems, so on and so forth, they have the ability to create a point-in-time reference of that data on the particular SAN itself, okay? So we would call that proprietary. It does that on a schedule. You have to configure it and turn it on, but most SAN vendors have the ability to create these snapshots. And because those snapshots are accessible through that SAN framework, they're actually not available for things like ransomware to propagate into that particular framework. They have a separate rule set of access control lists and mechanisms to actually get into the SAN, manipulate it, and change the data in it. The data within inside those SAN-based snapshots is also immutable. You know, it's a block-based reference, okay? So it's a really good thing to consider using on top of your existing data protection strategy inside your existing SAN framework. So things like your Dells, EMCs, your NetApps, they all have the ability to store those SAN-based snapshots. I often liken them to get out of jail free cards, okay? Because if something goes wrong within your environment, they're very, very useful to leverage and bring systems back online very, very easily, okay? Whilst we're on the subject of this, it's key to note that these are not backups, okay? Principle being that if you have a single SAN within your environment and you're doing snapshots, and that SAN fails, hardware failure, controller failure, whatever, multiple disk failure, then you lose your data and you lose the snapshots contained within it. So SAN snapshots are great. They are get out of jail free cards, but they are not backups. You still need to have a backup strategy beyond this. Now, one of the things we do at Veeam is we have some very nice integration with a number of labels. You can see them here. I'll just blow this particular image up for you. You can see we have some particular labels in here, and we have the ability within Veeam to create and actually manipulate, or manipulate is the wrong word, to actually query the data that lives within inside SAN-based snapshots. So we can interrogate them, we can cherry pick data out of them. So as much as those SAN snapshots exist within the SAN-based architecture, at Veeam Software, they have the ability to orchestrate those, allow you to navigate throughout them and take the data out and use it at your disposal, okay? One of the downsides of SAN snapshots is that because you have to manipulate the access control lists to actually levitate the data out, it can be quite a taxing thing from an administrative overhead to actually get your data back, but it's very useful to have them there. Deduplication, okay, dedupe appliances. These are devices we see within common organizations that are designed to store long-term data in a sequential fashion for very high dedupe and compression ratios. So if you're storing data for 2, 3, 4 years and longer, this is where these particular appliances really pay off. Now, what has this got to do with ransomware? Well, again, it's another framework. The data that's ingested into these particular platforms is actually written down in its own language. You actually need a Veeam proxy that lives inside the dedupe appliance that will ingest the data and bring it into the actual platform. So you couldn't, for example, as I showed you that example a moment ago with the demo, where I had a Z drive mapped, we all see drives mapped with inside our organizations to our laptops, maybe with shared resources, so on and so forth. With dedupe appliances, we can actually turn that protocol off. So the only way to get data into it, i.e. backup data, is to ingest it through a data mover, like a Veeam data mover. And I'm going to be fair to the industry here. It could be a competitor of ours. You could be using HP backup software, and it would have a HP protocol mover inside it. So it's using a separate architecture or separate framework to write that data down onto disk. So if you had one of these boxes and you had a ransomware breakout within your environment, it proliferated throughout all your file servers, all your VMs, everything. Your dedupe boxes, if configured in the correct fashion, would be completely safe and secure, okay? Now, on top of that, we have some particular integration we have with various vendors, EMC Data Domain, Exagrid, and HP Store Ones. We actually support backup data living on a mixture of different dedupe appliances. The only difference with these particular vendors is they have a special Veeam software that lives inside them. So out of the box, they come ready to work with Veeam, so they can actually understand our backup data far more eloquently. So the rule of thumb is we work with any dedupe box. These guys just have special integration with us, okay? So it's another framework to consider in your resiliency strategy against ransomware. And physical air gap. Consider things like physical air gap. You know, tape is having a mini resurgence. I'm seeing some of my customers coming back now and actually deploying tape within their environments after so many years of us trying to actually squeeze it out of their environments. It's not something that we at Veeam are advocating. We support writing data to tape quite happily, but it is a manual, it's a laborious, and it's an overhead managing tape. A lot of organizations have had that in their strategy for the last 5 years to remove tape, but we are seeing a mini resurgence. The unique byproduct of tape is that it has a physical air gap around it. So when you ship it away from your site, you've then revoked that data, and it is an immutable point in time that, you know, when you pick that tape up and it's a tangible device you can hold, you know, this is my data from 2016. It's excellent. It's valuable. Okay. So again, probably the most obvious strategy in the protection against ransomware. And mixed repositories, very interesting. So we often see a lot of organizations using SMB shares, typically on Windows, for disk shares, okay? I would say as an SE, I'm out in the field, I see probably maybe 80% of my customers storing their backup data on Windows architecture. So bear in mind that when you do that, the file system that's presented is going to be something like NTFS or REFS, or back in the day it was FAT, and that provides a file system, okay? And that file system needs an executable or an MSI to actually run against it and manipulate the files, or essentially encrypt the files that live within inside it. We just saw a moment ago the actual executable I ran on that demonstration was a .exe, short for executable. Okay, so that is designed for Windows. What we don't see is ransomware variants that can run on both platforms. And fundamentally, we probably won't see that because you'd need a separate protocol language to actually do that. You'd have to have almost 2 ransomware variants landing at the same time to infect maybe a Windows system and a Solaris system, or a Solaris system and a Linux system. So think about having different repositories. Okay, Linux is largely commercially very viable. You know, it's not expensive. Spin up your backup architecture on a different file system, still have security around it, maybe put it in a separate VLAN. You've created then a separate file-based framework within your environment. Your endpoints, your servers and your users are using Windows, but your storage architecture or your backup architecture is running in Linux. You know, think about that. Really easy to deploy. Seeing a lot of customers adopt that now. Really, really sensible. And moving on to actually what we do at Veeam, we do have an additional piece of software within our arsenal called Veeam One, okay? And it has the ability to look at data on a day-by-day basis. We are integrating with things like vCenter, with things like SCVMM from Microsoft, or you know, Virtual Machine Manager in Hyper-V. Okay, and we're seeing data on a regular basis. We're seeing the behavioral trend of data on a regular frequency. So we can look at signatures of data where maybe a certain portion of the network may have had something that has been encrypted and is slowly encrypting that data but still presenting it. We're seeing ransomware being very intelligent now in terms of where it acts in a silent mode. So it actually sits on your environment. It will sit there in a silent mechanism, a bit like Stuxnet, okay, and it will wait, I don't know, 30 days, and then it will deploy itself after 30 days because it knows that most people do a backup retention of 30 days. And if your backup today is falsified, but it's also falsified from 30 days ago, then it knows when you restore from your backup, your backup is also going to be again corrupted, or when you bring it online, the ransomware will just execute itself. So very intelligent mechanisms they're using. So within Veeam One, we actually have a built-in ransomware activity or possible ransomware activity rule set defined. So you can actually run this against your environment. It will look at the backup data and it will look at the change rate, because what ransomware is doing is encrypting data, so it's changing it. So we would normally see around 8 to 12% change rate across the board within most end user customer data. Excuse me. Just get a sip of my water. Okay, now with ransomware, we would see that spike significantly. Okay, we would see that go up maybe 100%, maybe 50%, depending on how much of your data it's actually going to encrypt, what it's been written to do. Okay, so bear that in mind with Veeam One. We have some nice reports within there generally, but this is one that's been designed specifically to look at anything that is maybe a little bit malevolent running beneath the surface. And one of the general rules of thumb to adopt within your backup strategy generally is something called the 3-2-1 rule. It's something that we at Veeam didn't necessarily design ourselves. It's just something that we actively advocate. And it's all about having 3 copies of your data, one of those being the production data, stored on 2 separate media types or 2 separate media zones. So one of those could be disk, one of those could be tape, one of those could be disk, and one of those could be cloud, okay, for an example. And then having one of those particular media zones off-site. So again, I talked about providing that air gap earlier, so moving data off-site into a separate region, a separate geo, okay? And one of the things that we actually do at Veeam is we have the ability to check backups when they complete, okay? Actually make sure that they're healthy. This is often called verification, and back in the day, verification was actually quite a taxing process, because what it does is it runs a checksum against the data it read from your production storage. So if your backup takes 20 hours, the verification checksum would take 20 hours as well. So your backup window would be 40 hours. The first thing that backup administrators do is turn it off, you know, because they can't afford the time for it to run. So with Veeam, we actually have a very unique bit of software called, a feature I should say, called Sure Backup. It basically spins the virtual machines up off the backup architecture, takes 2 minutes, and it checks not only that the backup is healthy, but it actually runs application tests against the data and the files living inside the backup. So when you adopt your 3-2-1 rule, okay, 3 copies of your data, 2 separate media, one of those being off-site, we know 100% that you haven't got any errors on that particular data. It's all good and well adopting the 3-2-1 strategy. But if your data set or your backup data is corrupted or invaluable, then it's, quite frankly, it's pointless. All right. So you need to make sure your data is healthy. And nearing to the end of these sort of ransomware suggestions here is endpoint software restrictions, or GPOs, something that we might see built within a Windows environment. If you're running Active Directory and you have a couple of good admin guys, think about deploying things within your environment in group policy. This is getting maybe a little bit technical. If there's anybody on this particular webinar that's maybe business-led, this is all about utilizing group policy, which is one of the frameworks we have with inside Active Directory, to control the behavior of how your environment works, because your environment typically is going to be built on a Windows platform at the endpoint. Okay, so we'd use group policy, we'd set up a software restriction policy, we'd exclude certain folders from allowing executables to run, the sort of common ones we might see that ransomware deploys into, maybe the internet download cache on all of your end user workstations. And then when they try to run those particular executables, you saw on the demo I did at the beginning that I was able to right click on it and run it quite freely. The end user would actually come up with this: your system administrators block this program for more information, blah, 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 blah. That's great. It may cause a slight overhead when people are doing, installing printers and maybe some generic drivers. But ultimately, think about what's more important. You need to maybe use this across a small crop or a big crop of your users. Maybe you've got some power users, maybe some users you trust where you wouldn't want to apply this particular GPO. You could do that. You could maybe isolate those GPO rule sets for only certain users if they're in a particular department where you think they're maybe particularly exposed. Maybe you've got marketing people that are going out in the field and they're interacting with their community, trading USB sticks. You think they're a particular risk, so you deploy that GPO against those particular user subsets. I'm not picking on marketing people, just to be straight there. Okay, so just think about how to utilize Active Directory and some of the native tool sets that live within Windows to your advantage. And actually, final screen there is actually the backend administrators would actually get a warning when anything has been executed against the environment. So they're getting alerting from their Windows system on those error logs. So some resources just to cap off with I've only skimmed the surface today in terms of what content is out there from Veeam around our strategy against helping our end user customers to protect against ransomware. There's a http://vee.am ransomware white paper series. I'm sure they could have thought of something maybe a bit more snappy for the URL there, but ultimately, yes, 2D metric scanner there, and some content on the right hand side, lots of white papers. Some of these are very high level. They're business led directives around around how to protect, but also some very nitty gritty documents as well. A dozen pages in there about all of the good stuff you can deploy within your environment. So check that out. I have got a link at the end of the webinar that you can copy and paste if you wish. Okay, so loads of resources there on the Veeam website. And also some other more interactive content. We've actually got it's a 5 or 6 minute video on YouTube with this particular end user customer, Bedford School. They had a ransomware outbreak. They deployed Veeam maybe two or so months before their outbreak, and they were so happy with how easy it was to restore using the Veeam software that they got in touch with our marketing team. See, now I'm advocating marketing guys being good guys, and said, look, we want to do a joint campaign with you. We want to tell people how good the experience was, not the ransomware thing, but how to recover from it. They didn't pay the ransom fee, and they had all of their data restored in a very short space of time. So YouTube, Google search Veeam and Bedford School, come straight up. It's a really good watch, but again, it's just a show of some of the many customers that are using our software to protect themselves. So in summary, I'm not going to read these out for you. Some of the notes I've touched on, far more than this out there. I've just skimmed across the surface, like I say. Think about number 8, implement network segmentation and VLANs, things that have been around for decades, just making sure you deploy that segmentation, that ability to break up your framework of your environment into different portions, maybe have your production network separated from your backup network, and maybe have different a security account with a very specific set of passwords or access rights to certain users that have access to it. So a quick summary there. And number 10, train your employees, awareness of social engineering. I think this is almost this is always fighting a losing battle here. I think users will always need education around the best way to go about interacting with IT. I myself used to work in support, and I saw users who had viruses or outbreaks, and they did some really things that, I don't want to say the word stupid, but things that just weren't sensible. So we need to be aware of social engineering, how important it is, and some of the things we can cultivate within our staff to make sure they're forearmed and forewarned, okay? And just a summary on the ransomware piece. This is maybe just a bit of light humor for you at the very end of the ransomware piece specifically, is a thing called 44 bits of entropy. It's something that I actually quite like. It says, through 20 years of effort, we successfully trained everyone to use passwords that are hard for humans to remember, but easy for computers to guess. And you may have seen passwords given to you from maybe an administrator in the past that was particularly complex. It had, uppercase and lowercase. It had maybe numbers as well as letters. Maybe it had some symbols in it as well. Well, that's very, that's great for want of a better word. But the first thing that users do when they have a very cryptic password is they write it down, okay? And that defeats the object of having a secure password. Our passwords are our own personal mechanism we use to authenticate or to access something that is our own particular treasure chest, okay? So we have this thing here at the bottom left, 4 random words, correct, horse, battery, staple, it's 44 bits, okay? So it's very, very difficult to guess what this would be. And if we were going to process some sort of password hack at that, 2 to the power of 44 equals 550 years at 1,000 guesses a second. So that you would gauge as being a very hard password to guess. Okay, it's all lowercase, it's 4 words, correct, horse, battery, staple, and I bet you at the end of this particular webinar, you'll probably remember that particular password, okay? So think about sensible passwords to use, maybe you personally when you're doing your internet banking, all that good stuff, so you don't have to write down your passwords. It's a real big no-no with passwords being written down, and it's the way that social engineering really gets into us and exploits us. Just a little bit of humor. Back to the demo, I nearly forgot. So let's just flick up my virtual machine and see what's happened here. We can see straight away, this is the aftermath. This is what many of your users will have seen when being faced with ransomware within your environment. We can see here that the actual file has kicked up a prompt for us to actually want to go and open up this type of HTML file. I'm going to just ignore that for the moment. This is the folder that I wrote the exploitation into. First thing you can see is the Adobe icon has gone. It's actually deleted itself. It's clearing up after itself. It doesn't want the end user to be able to distribute this to its AV company or its, its particular vendor that it uses for antivirus, okay? So it's clearing up after itself. It's given us this HTML file. It's asking us to open it up with a browser. It's going to point us in a direction to download something that is going to be a browser URL for an onion link. We have to download the Tor project browser, which I've got installed, but I won't waste time with that today. And we can see on the desktop, we can see that's taken place. It's actually done this for us, which is old now. It's a Locky variant, like I said at the beginning. This has been around for a couple of years now. But ultimately, you can see, hopefully, there the mechanics of how easy that was to deploy. And if I go to my computer, let's go and check out the Z drive, because I mapped a drive on this particular system. Here's my Z drive, so you can actually see the Z drive, and you can see all those good files I had earlier have now also been encrypted. So very powerful. And like I say, the Locky variant only encrypts those first few kilobytes. So irrespective of how many files you have in your environment, how many file shares you've got, it's going to proliferate through them and corrupt them all. Okay, so just bear that in mind. Got to take these things carefully. Right, where are we moving forward to? Availability. Last 15 minutes here. I just want to cover off maybe some broad strokes in terms of Veeam, what we're doing around availability for our end user customers. This does tie in nicely with the ransomware piece. It's about, shipping your data off site, allowing you to capture it and actually utilize it and leverage it, but actually doing that in a cost efficient manner. Bit of an overview in terms of where our products sit today. We can see on the bottom left-hand side, we have a particular product called Veeam Backup and Replication. It's a bit like Ronseal quick drying wood paint. It does exactly what it says in the tin. We also have some side-by-side products with that, Veeam One and the Management Pack. I touched on Veeam One earlier as a monitoring, reporting, and capacity planning solution. Also has some very nice tool sets in there to do signature detection for ransomware. We also have agents, okay, and these are for protecting workloads that might live off-site. Maybe you've got a workload that lives in a cloud provider you can't deploy a virtual machine backup to. Maybe you've got physical architecture. Maybe you've got physical Windows or physical Linux deployment systems within inside your environment, or even the end user laptops, the guys around the road. You could deploy the agent down to that so you could get backups of their laptops, okay? What I'm getting to is that we also have virtual backup, which we've always been known for at Veeam. We also have the ability to back up physical and cloud workloads, and we can take all that good availability content, that data protection, and we can mobilize that into something we like to call Cloud Connect. And it's something that we do in partnership with Bytes, okay? And it allows you to store your data, whether it be backup data, maybe that is a VM replica data, DR as a service, okay, into that partner ecosystem. So you know Bytes, you know the sales guys, you know the techies, and you know where their data center is. So you can actually utilize their infrastructure as an extension of your own IT environment and store your backup data there off-site. Okay, so you're creating that air gap in a very cost-effective mechanism. That's how our product architecture works today. As the name suggests, backup and replication, we have the ability to store data as a VM living on another hypervisor somewhere else. So it means that you can spin up virtual machines very, very quickly, okay? You wouldn't want to do that with backups. With replicas, you might want to, okay? Main difference between backups and replication, I always say, is that backups are stored as a file living on some sort of disk architecture. Replications are stored as a VM, whether that be a Hyper-V VM, whether that be a Nutanix VM or a VMware VM, and we can spin them up very quickly. That's the main differentiator between backups and replication, okay? So with Veeam software, we have the ability to mobilize those VM copies to another hypervisor, maybe in your system, maybe it's on another provider system like Bytes, okay? And also, we often challenge them when we're moving data across the wire with internet speeds and latency, okay? So we have the ability to WAN accelerate your backup data, WAN accelerate your replicas. So we're utilizing software WAN acceleration here to recognize duplicate levels of data, cache them into a WAN folder cache, and then allows you to send less data across the infrastructure. Okay, so very, very intelligent way, because data is getting bigger. We're seeing it harder for customers to mobilize their data because it costs. And again, a summary of Cloud Connect. It's the thing that I spoke about earlier. This would represent your infrastructure on the left-hand side, your Hyper-V stack, your VMware stack, and your production storage. And on the right-hand side, you've got essentially what is your cloud gateway. Your cloud gateway sits at the service provider, someone like Bytes, and they act as a backup as a service target or a DR as a service target for your data, your VMs, and your files, whether that be virtual or physical, okay? You can use it for all that good stuff. And here's a quick summary of how our sort of stack looks today. This is called the 4 cloud slide. If I walk around this very quickly, you can see on the right-hand side, we have public cloud, things like Azure, AWS, Google Cloud Platform Services. We have the ability to back up to public cloud and utilize storage within those public cloud entities, okay? We also have the ability to back up from public cloud. So you could actually have a lot of organizations now spinning up virtual machines and applications and SaaS into public cloud. You want to protect that data. So with Veeam, we have the ability to transition that data back on-prem or maybe into a private data center. So you're creating that dual cloud scenario for your availability strategy. Top right-hand corner, SaaS, things like Microsoft Office 365, absolutely brilliant platform. Microsoft's main focus here is providing a reliable platform for you to store emails, SharePoint, OneDrive, business, all that good stuff inside their infrastructure. The consequence of the data living inside it is your responsibility. That's one of the things that Microsoft will actively recommend to you, okay? Microsoft, even litigation hold, is not a native backup tool set. So you need to think about protecting the data, protecting maybe the email database that lives inside Office 365. If somebody to log in and delete a load of user accounts or delete a load of emails, they won't be accessible for you to restore from. So with Veeam software, we have the ability to back up things like Exchange Online, bring that to an on-prem platform in a very cost-efficient mechanism so that if you have a problem with your Office 365 stack, user accounts gone, email data gone, you can restore from that and replay that data. Top left-hand side is private cloud and on-premises. This is our sort of bread and butter. This is where people deploy our software into their standard infrastructure, their on-site IT deployment against their servers. That's where we came from. That's where we're still going to go to. That's not going to be going away. We've been doing that for a long time. We continue to. And the bottom left-hand corner is Veeam Cloud Service Providers. This is all about the integration we have with people like Bytes for them to stand up Veeam software and provide that as a managed service or backup as a service, DR as a service to their end customers. And that green box in the middle is a quick summary of all the products we have today, but just only a small glimpse of them. We have far more products available. So, rounding up now, a couple of slides just to finish off. Cost savings. We said we'd just mention this at the very end. Some of the things we would like to encourage people to think about is compute density. 10 years ago, I saw people, customers adopting virtualization, servers with 128, 256 gigs of RAM, 1 or 2 CPUs. What we see with Veeam and VMware is socket-based licensing, okay? So the more density we can get in within our hypervisors when we're scaling those, we're actually going to reduce the need for Veeam licenses and VMware licenses and Microsoft licenses and all that good stuff. So think about your compute stack. Think about having high density. You know, I'm seeing customers now scaling servers x86 architecture with 2, 4, 6 terabytes of RAM within inside them. Okay, this is RAM, not storage, RAM. Okay, so the ability to scale into the thousands of virtual machines onto a single x86 architecture. It's fantastic, but saves you money. Target integration. I talked about the dedupe appliances halfway through the slide deck. Yeah, they're great. They're not cheap, but you can actually do a homemade version of this using things like REFS. REFS stands for Resilient File System. It's one of the new fangled file systems from Microsoft. Actually came out in Server 2012. Didn't really cut the mustard. They got it right in version 2. It's actually called version 3, which is in Server 2016. And it allows that sequential layering of data. It allows Windows to act a little bit like a SAN. I mean, if you're a SAN guy, you'd probably shoot me in the kneecaps for saying that. But ultimately allows you to store, allows the SAN, I should say, the ability to understand blocks and block pointers. So with Veeam, because we're storing backup data, full backup sets to disk, they're duplicates. Okay, so things like REFS that come within Windows natively now, Server 2016, allow them to understand those duplicate blocks and send pointers to them. So we're seeing far higher scalability of file systems for backup data. So if you utilize things like REFS, it could be a very, very cost-saving platform to encourage in your system, or introduce into your system, I should say. And free products. Everyone likes free products, right? At Veeam, we have a very small but efficient set of products. We're not someone like Microsoft or VMware where they have thousands of products across their architecture. We have about 20 products to date, half of which are actually free. So the Veeam one I talked about earlier, we actually have a free version of that. You can deploy that into Windows, stand up a small little SQL database, gives you a cut down version of how Veeam one, the full fat version works, but it gives you some of the cool reporting, some of the excellent capacity planning tool sets you have. We also have our standard products available as a free product. Again, a lot of the functionality stripped out of it to allow us to essentially make revenue from the commercial products, but still gives you a very good and efficient way of backing up VMs applications in a free mechanism. So if you have a test and dev or a UAT environment, you might want to deploy our free product into that and actually start doing some basic primitive backups of it, okay, for free. And also our agents we talked about earlier. We have 3 versions of our agent for Windows, a free version, a workstation version, and a server version, okay? The free version, I see customers deploying that to all their laptops, okay? Deploy it to the laptops, get backups of the laptops, use some source-side caching. You know, absolutely great way to start backing up your endpoints that live within your environment. It might not be everyone. It might just be the CEO, you know, for crying out loud. If his laptop dies, do you want a backup of that particular laptop? Well, hey, yes, deploy the Veeam agent into that, back it up, store it into your Veeam backup repository. You've covered the CEO and any of the C-level board members. It'll make you look good at the end of the day, okay? So that was the penultimate slide. This is the summary session. We've got a bit of time now for questions, guys, so I'm more than happy to hear any out. Amy's still mediating the session, so I think she'll chirp in here. My details down the bottom left, and also there's a link there to our ransomware white paper, ransomware series papers if you need them.
Brilliant, thank you, George. So if you do have any questions at all, there is, so if you should look on the right-hand side of your screen, there is a questions box there. So if you type the questions out in there, I'll read those out for George. Thanks.
Yeah, I can't see the questions, guys. So if you just tap them in, Amy can read them, and obviously we can go through those. Like Amy said, feel free to ping me an email if you do have any questions in the upshot of today. As an SE, we do advocate being in touch with our community. That doesn't have to be necessarily existing customers. It can be customers that are using the possibility of using Veeam and bringing that into their particular platforms. You know, that's an opportunity for us. So I'm available for guys that are already using Veeam and those that are potentially thinking about coming on board with using our software and how we can help. Anything there so far, Amy?
No questions yet. If we just wait one more minute.
Hopefully that means I covered off quite a lot of the content and answered everyone's questions during the session.
Yeah, hopefully. So if we just wait, just wait a minute or so, and then if not, then I'll close the webinar. So as mentioned at the beginning as well, everyone, that I will send you all a link to the recording, probably this afternoon or tomorrow morning. And there is a feedback form at the end as well. So if you would like to take any questions offline, just pop them in there and we will get back to you. Right, okay, I don't think there are any questions, George. So thanks everyone for attending today, and thank you so much, George, also for presenting on the webinar. So I'll send you all the recording. So thanks everyone for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy.